Welcome everyone. It is 1:02, so we want to welcome you to this webinar. So before we start, just a little notes. First, we thanks to the contribution of World Vision Canada, one of our signatory organizations. We are able to provide French to English and English to French interpretation for the session today. If you would like to listen to the language translation, you go at the bottom of the Zoom window. You should see an interpretation icon, as interpretation is now enabled, if I'm correct. So if you're not seeing the icon, I would like you to check if you have maybe downloaded the latest Zoom version. And if you're using the Zoom browser instead of the app, it won't work. Donc, pour ceux et celles qui voudraient de la traduction automatique, grâce à World Vision Canada, nous avons accès à la traduction. Donc, seulement aller voir l'icône dans le bas et sélectionner la langue de votre choix pour avoir la traduction automatique. Ensuite, as you probably noticed, we are using the webinar format today. So we will still be able to interact with you, and there's ways for you to interact with the speakers. We have a Q&A session at the end of today's session. And this will be the time to ask your questions to the task force members by typing them in the Q&A. So you can always chat in the chat box, but you can also ask questions in the Q&A for the end of the session. We ask that your questions remain related to the work of the task force and the findings of the report, as we are all eager to listen and learn from the extensive process that the task force has undertaken to examine the progress and ways forward for the sector. Before all that, I wish to recognize that I am joining you from the city of Ottawa, located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin, Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat people. In a virtual event, we're all participating from many parts of Canada, I'm sure, among the 146 participants now. So if you want, you can share with us in the chat from where you're calling, what are the unceded territory parts of Canada you are zooming in from. And if you don't already know, I encourage you to do research on the original peoples where you are located. If you do already know, share with us. And this recognition, I must say, serves both to remind us of the contributions of those who came before us and of the importance of working daily on reconciliation and dialogue with the original caretakers of this land. We wish to also specifically recognize that today is Indigenous Peoples Day, a day for all people in so-called Canada, to recognize and celebrate the unique heritage, the diverse cultures and outstanding contributions of First Nations, Inuit, as well as Métis people. And if, like me, you belong to the settler people who benefit from the privilege of a country built on colonialism, then I hope this land acknowledgement can serve both as a moment of respect to our First Nations, on whose land we live and work, as well as a moment of reflexive discomfort, and that we will talk about today. We can take this moment to recognize, among other things, Canada's appalling record in perpetrating racist policies and practices towards Indigenous people across Turtle Island, especially in light of the discoveries of the mass grave a few weeks ago at multiple residential schools. Canadian efforts towards anti-racism and international cooperation must rest upon solid progress towards the acknowledgement of our own privileges. And today's session, we will talk about the anti-racist framework developed by the international cooperation sector, some initial findings from the baseline data received by signatories, and explore how the sector can do better and work together for systemic change. So this acknowledgement is part also of recognizing our own privileges, which is part of the Anti-Racist Task Force mandate. So after introducing the work that we did on the report, I will then give the floor to the Honourable Karina Gould, who is here with us, and then to the co-chairs of the Anti-Racism Task Force, who will tell you more about the data and our recommendation for the sector. So for those of you who don't know, Cooperation Canada convened an advisory group in the summer of 2020. This advisory group has provided a platform to develop a collective approach to anti-racism in the sector. And then we drafted a framework for anti-racism efforts in the Canadian international cooperation sector. We will share with you in the chat the framework. Because we wrote a draft and then we opened for the frameworks for comments, advice, suggestions from the sector in the fall of 2020. And you were many to help us strengthen the framework. We've convened many forums. We relied on our informal networks of specialists, called upon advice, feedback from colleagues, from friends, from allies, both in Canada, but also from our partners globally. And these collective conversations, I must say, were sometimes perhaps uncomfortable as we examined our personal privileges. And I believe they should be uncomfortable. Examining our privileges in a colonial world where racism is systemic should be uncomfortable, especially for people who are born and who act on behalf of Western countries. And after this collective effort of writing this framework, we launched the final version of this in January 2021. And the deadline to sign the framework was in March. And since then, 71 organizations have signed. And they were then asked to fill in a survey. A lot of you are probably from those organizations who have signed on the framework. So you were asked to fill in a survey on anti-racist practices in your organizations. And so there was a framework. Now we collected data on anti-racist practices in our sector. We convened a task force and a working group. So the task force role is to coordinate and produce annual reports based on the answers to that survey. And this is a report we are presenting to you today. And the working group on the other side will develop action plan and priorities for the sector based on these data. And so today is the baseline report for future action. And it will be published in French and English later this week, and we will send it to you via email. So before I give the floor to Minister Gould, I would like to acknowledge the incredible work of the task force, which you can see their names today on the screen, but also of the advisory group who was first tasked to write the framework. We also would like to acknowledge the work of Dara Dillon and Maggie Zhang, who were the peer reviewers for the report. And so on this, we must acknowledge that it's a lot of work from a lot of people. It was a real, true collective effort, and we're very happy to present to you today the result of that effort. Before we start with the data, we now wish to welcome the Honourable Karina Gould, the Minister of International Development. We welcome the chance to listen to her introductory remarks to today's session and to learn more about the Government of Canada's commitment to anti-racism in international cooperation. The Minister will be providing brief opening remarks and then will remain on the line to listen to today's discussion. Minister Gould, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Micah, and thank you to everyone for the opportunity to be with you today as you launch the first baseline report of the anti-racism framework for Canada's international cooperation sector. I'm joining you from Burlington, Ontario, which is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis. From the Anishinaabe to the Haudenosaunee and the Métis, our lands spanning from Lake Ontario to the Niagara Escarpment are steeped in Indigenous history. The territory is mutually covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy, the Ojibwe, and other allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. And I would like to acknowledge that the land on which I'm gathering is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. So with that, I would like to begin by congratulating all of you on the very hard work of the last year as your organizations shared knowledge, identified commitments, and pledged to recognize and take action to address systemic racism in Canada's international cooperation sector. And as a white woman, I recognize and acknowledge the privilege that I hold and carry, and the privilege that I also have to be part of this really important conversation. We only have to look at recent events here in Canada to know, and quite frankly, to feel the urgency of this work. Racism is real, and it is here at home. The past year has brought to light the long-standing experiences of discrimination that Indigenous, Black, and other racialized Canadians have faced for far too long. We've seen a dramatic rise in anti-Asian hate over the last year, increased rates of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, the bodies of 215 Indigenous children found buried around a residential school, a discovery that we know will only keep growing, a Muslim family murdered in a horrific attack while out for an evening stroll. I hope that these events have caused Canadians from coast to coast to coast to look inward and also to see their country's history, but also our present in a different light. And that's how it should be. Nous devons reconnaître le racisme systémique et aborder les défis uniques auxquels les peuples autochtones, les Canadiens noirs et les autres Canadiens racialisés continuent d'être confrontés. Mais reconnaître qu'il y a un problème n'est que la première étape. Une société exempte de racisme et de discrimination exige un engagement inlassable et une plus grande volonté politique. Le silence et l'inaction n'ont pas leur place dans ce combat pour l'inclusion, mieux dit, l'appartenir et la justice. Nous devons nous mobiliser pour amorcer des changements afin d'éradiquer le racisme systémique. Et ce qui est important au pays est aussi important dans notre travail à l'étranger. C'est pourquoi Affaires mondiales Canada accueille favorablement le travail entrepris par le groupe consultatif pour la mise en place d'une cadre globale pour les efforts de lutte contre le racisme dans le secteur de la coopération internationale du Canada et reconnaît que nous faisons partie de ce travail aussi. Racism is a global concern, a root cause of exclusion, and one of the greatest barriers to progress, development, and our collective well-being. On the international scene, Canada defines inclusion as, quote, full and meaningful participation of all, without discrimination, in social, economic, cultural, and democratic life, end quote. So, where do we start? Well, first of all, we start by recognizing that we have work to do ourselves, that the institutions we operate in need to improve, and that we as representatives of Canada have to see systemic racism for what it is and what it has meant and continues to mean in our country. We have to approach this conversation, this work, from a place of humility and honesty. And quite frankly, we have a lot of work to do. And certainly at Global Affairs Canada, we are examining our approach to inclusion and diversity in our own internal structures and in international development to make it more concerted and intentional. And our feminist policy provides a good framework, a strong foundation for inclusion, diversity, and importantly, anti-racism. The policy is human rights-based and inclusive and extends beyond empowering women and girls to transform power imbalances more generally. The fière recognizes that individuals have multiple intersecting identities that shape their experience of discrimination, including gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, economic and migration status, disability, language, and age. And for me, it's about going beyond inclusion towards belonging. Nous sommes également guidés par notre politique de partenariat avec la société civile pour l'aide internationale, qui s'engage à ce que les politiques et les programmes d'aide internationale du Canada soient fondés sur les droits de la personne et l'inclusion. C'est pourquoi Affaires mondiales Canada soutient les organisations de la société civile canadienne et tous ses partenaires pour qu'ils intègrent une approche féministe, inclusive et intersectionnelle par le biais, par exemple, de l'analyse comparative entre les sexes plus et d'analyse fondée sur les droits de la personne et les principes d'égalité, de non-discrimination, de participation, de responsabilité et de transparence. Nous soutenons aussi les programmes qui ciblent plus précisément l'inclusion, le respect de la diversité et l'antiracisme. Permettez-moi de vous donner quelques exemples. For example, we have the Inclusion, Diversity, and Human Rights Fund that prioritizes human rights and support to human rights defenders, religious freedom, inclusion, and respect for diversity. The International Aboriginal Youth Internships, which facilitate intercultural exchanges between Aboriginal youth from Canada and local communities abroad, and the Global Centre for Pluralism to address injustice, inequality, and exclusion, and anti-racist initiatives. We are also working through our board representatives, donor support groups, and governance bodies to promote better practices on diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism. Our multilateral anti-racism engagement includes compliance with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and support for the International Decade for People of African Descent. At Global Affairs, as an organization, we are also looking at these issues. The department has created the Office of Human Rights, Freedoms, and Inclusion to promote acceptance and promote differences. And in September 2020, we established a departmental anti-racism secretariat to address systemic racism and racial discrimination internally. We are working to make our workforce more diverse while we promote inclusion, belonging, and respect for diversity in our international work. In terms of project delivery, we are looking at how to better mainstream or integrate inclusive and intersectional approaches throughout the project cycle with stronger tools to integrate the human rights-based approach and GBAs+. As I said, to be effective in addressing racism and discrimination, we cannot stand still, and we must be constantly asking ourselves whether we have truly addressed the issue. What more can we be doing to address racism? Recent debates around anti-racism and the decolonization of aid highlight the transformative role that greater localization in international assistance can play. Shifting more decision-making, resources, power, capacity, and project and program management to local partners, while adhering to principles of transparency, accountability, and financial stewardship, can also increase efficiency and effectiveness. Canada is working hard to support and strengthen the role of local and national actors as leaders and implementers of development and humanitarian efforts, while continuing to recognize the important role of international partners and Canadian civil society organizations. Alors, je dois conclure. Il reste beaucoup à faire pour éliminer le racisme et la discrimination. C'est pourquoi Affaires mondiales Canada s'est engagé à travailler avec vous pour éliminer la discrimination et le racisme par le biais d'efforts en matière d'équité, de diversité et d'inclusion. Combattre le racisme et rendre notre monde plus équitable, plus diversifié et plus inclusif signifie que chacun d'entre nous doit s'engager à rendre nos lieux de travail, nos communautés, nos espaces publics pas seulement plus inclusifs pour tous, mais actuellement anti-raciste. Recent and current events in Canada and around the world have shown us it is not enough to not be racist. We have to be intentionally anti-racist. We have to look deeply at our own internal views, policies, and procedures to ensure we are active, engaged allies in the fight against racism. It is necessary, and we have to be transparent in our actions. The anti-racism framework you are launching today is an important part of our work in this area, and I thank you for it. Thank you for letting me be part of this conversation.
Merci infiniment, Madame la Ministre. Thank you very much for being here. You're right, we really need to address this from a place of humility, and we're not perfect. And the overall recommendation, I think, of this report is to be open to be challenged. And I think you're right to say that it is not enough to be non-racist. We really need to be actively anti-racist. And despite the legacy of this sector, which is, as we mentioned in the framework and in the report, has been based on colonial roots, we still need to address these now and be challenged in maybe our persistent sustaining of systemic racism. Before I give the floor to our fabulous co-chairs of the task force, I would like to know who's in the room. So we are a lot of people, actually 177 participants. So I would like to know as organizations signed the framework. So as your organization signed it, please answer the poll right now that's on your screen, so we know who we are talking to. And Aislinn also shared the framework in the chat. I'll give you 1 minute to do that. And Aislinn maybe can put in the chat the answer to the person who's in charge of the poll. Do we have an answer? Good. So 71% good. So we are directly talking to the ones that we should be talking to. So that's great. We are continuing this conversation with you all, and we will be continuing this conversation with you. So it's good to know. For those of you who don't know if your organization signed, I suggest you ask to see if maybe next year, because it's, as the co-chairs are going to speak about, we will be welcoming new signatories on a rolling basis. So I'm glad to present to you first Musu Taylor-Lewis, who is the Director of Communications, Fundraising and Public Engagement for the Canadian Food Grains Bank. Prior to this position, Musu worked as a Director of Communication at Tier Fund Canada, following over a decade of work in nonprofit and public sector organizations in British Columbia. After Musu, Tiana Ridley-Padmore will be talking. She is an equity and inclusion strategist. And now with World Vision Canada, Tiana has graduated from York University, where she received her master in public policy, public administration, and law. Her thesis is focused on the intersections of race, gender, class, and policy reform. Tiana will first present findings, and then Musa will present the recommendations. So Tiana, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, Micah. Thank you, Minister Gould. So good afternoon. My name is Tiana Ridley-Padmore, and today I'm going to walk you through the ARC survey methodology and findings. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the survey was developed based off of the anti-racism framework that organizations in Canada's international cooperation sector co-created and signed in March of this year. So the framework included a set of commitments to tackling racial inequality in three main areas. The first area is in administration and human resources, recognizing that the priorities set at the administrative and human resource level shape organizational culture and determine how employees experience the workplace. This area acknowledges that creating safe and equitable work environments requires approaches that are conscious of and responsive to racial disparities in recruitment, promotion, retention, salary, reporting, and feedback practices. The second area of focus is in communications, fundraising, and advocacy, recognizing that global power imbalances have long determined who gets to be the storyteller, whose stories are told, and how a story will be told. And in international cooperation, where our visual and verbal expressions of need can be very much tied to revenue generations, the language and imagery commonly used by our sector has a history of perpetuating harmful and racially biased narratives. And those narratives don't just end with any one single piece of content. Often, the negative impact of communications that rely on racial stereotypes feed into long-lasting assumptions about Indigenous, Black, and people from historically disadvantaged countries. And finally, the third area of focus is program designs and operations, recognizing that organizations with great intentions to promote human rights may unintentionally treat the priorities, knowledge, and values that they have identified as being superior and absolute. And so when we talk about decolonizing international cooperation, we're talking about an intentional commitment to anti-racism that acknowledges that the global hierarchies that we see in our work are the same power imbalances that have created a need for international aid in the first place. Can we go to the next slide, please? So for each of the commitments made in the framework, indicators were developed to get a pulse on the state of anti-racism efforts in the sector and to track the progress being made against each commitment. It was really important to us to take a really collaborative approach as we designed the framework and the survey, recognizing and valuing the perspectives and priorities of diverse stakeholders in our sector. So indicators were developed by a range of anti-racist practitioners, monitoring and evaluation experts in the sector, and then those indicators became the basis for the ARC survey. And once the survey was developed, it was sent out to representatives of organizations who had signed on to the framework. And in total, the survey was completed by 71 signatories, including regional international cooperation councils. So it represents about 350 organizations within the sector. And respondents included small, medium, large, as well as federated and non-federated organizations involved in international development, humanitarian assistance, peace building, trade partnerships, conservation efforts, et cetera, et cetera. And so I say this to say that the survey findings do suggest a wide set of perspectives coming out from the survey. There were 39 closed content questions included in the survey, as well as accompanying open text questions, and the average response rate was 99% for each question. So the results are a good representation of where our signatories are. And then the data that we received and the open text answers that we received were reviewed, recoded as necessary, and cross-checked between members. And I also want to note that responses were kept very secure. Only a small subset of the task force had access to this data to protect confidentiality. So now I'd like to present some of the results. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, I'm not going to list all of the stats that came out of the survey, though all of them were really, really interesting. So I'll speak to some of our high-level findings and encourage you all to read the ARC report for a full breakdown of the results. So in terms of the high-level findings, I'm going to highlight 4 today. The first is that only 39% of respondents reported having anti-racist principles incorporated in their hiring practices. Further, only 51% of respondents indicated that any of their staff responsible for hiring have completed racial bias awareness or anti-oppression training. So in other words, only roughly half of respondents have hiring staff trained in anti-racism, and most organizations do not have policies in place to reduce racial bias. Further, some respondents who indicated that their staff had completed anti-racist training actually reference intercultural competency training or diversity training, suggesting a lack of coherence in an understanding of anti-racism and the tenets within that. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the next finding that I wanted to highlight shows that 84% of organizations have staff or volunteers who participate in equity, inclusion, and anti-racist groups, yet only 44% responded having staff whose official responsibilities relate to diversity and inclusion, and only 35% reported having staff whose official responsibilities relate to anti-racism or anti-oppression. So these findings suggest that there's a lot of anti-racism work being done. There's a lot of staff across organizations who are involved in anti-racism work, yet less than half of respondents have dedicated personnel whose responsibilities include this work. So this suggests that the anti-racism work being carried out is likely being done on a volunteer basis, in addition to regular roles and responsibilities, and potentially without concrete institutional buy-in, without proper considerations for time requirements, or even without adequate training. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we found that 62% of organizations said that they had shared communications with an explicit anti-racist objective in the past 24 months. And 78% of respondents indicated that their organization had shared communications that were captured directly by an in-country content producer in the past 24 months. So these results are really positive. It shows a widespread attempt to improve power imbalances in the sector communications, to include and ensure that content is coming from local content producers, to ensure that communications that are putting out do have an explicit anti-racist focus. However, these efforts seem to be quite ad hoc, as most organizations also reported that they don't have an explicit anti-racism policy generally or in their communications. They don't have explicit anti-racist objectives either. And many respondents revealed that they collected content from in-country partners, but those partners were rarely involved in the editing and approval of the content. So there seems to have been a shift and movement towards incorporating and redistributing power imbalances in communications, but without a clear focus or policy forward. And similarly, when it came to engagement with in-country partners in programs and operations, 70% of organizations do not require program staff to receive anti-racist training, and only about half have an official procedure in place for staff in decision-making roles who are involved in project activities. So findings, as well as the open text responses to that survey, showed that there are few concerted efforts that are being taken to meaningfully redress global hierarchies in international aid work in our programs and operations. And this brings me to my last finding. Can we go to the next slide, please? So many organizations reported that they do have mandatory training within their organizations on a variety of topics, such as gender. And a number of organizations reported that they have official guidelines and policies in place for hiring practices, public communications, project operations, and monitoring and evaluation. And this is great. So even though anti-racist principles are rarely incorporated in any of these policies and procedures, the findings reveal that at least half of signatories already had the foundation. So they already have the clear mechanisms, they already have mandatory trainings in place that can be revised, that can be built on to incorporate anti-racist principles and to take these commitments to a meaningful and tangible level. And so finally, I'd like to say that though there was no indicator included in the survey that measured this, as we went through the data and as we read through the new anti-racist initiatives that are being launched and the new anti-racist learning and training resources that are being made available within organizations, it became very, very clear to our analysis team that there is a willingness. There's a willingness within the sector to create anti-racist shifts. And even just the reality of signing on to the anti-racist framework, I think, is a testament to that willingness. And so now I will pass it over to Musu Taylor-Lewis, who can share the recommendations that we developed to help build on the momentum that we observed through a coherent, intentional, and sector-wide approach. Over to you, Musu.
Thank you so much, Tiana. My name is Musu Taylor-Lewis, and I am the Director of Resources and Public Engagement at Food Grains Bank, and it's been my privilege to work on this initiative and side by side with Tiana and so many other dedicated and thoughtful members of the task force and the advisory group. And so I'll launch right into the recommendations, but before I do that, I just want to give a little bit of setup for that. The recommendations that are offered in this report are certainly not intended to be comprehensive or sweeping. You can see that the highlighted findings show the willingness of people in the sector to make steps, but there is a lot of work to be done. When you see the full report, you'll see there's some low level of availability of anti-racism initiatives within the sector. So it's not intended to be comprehensive or sweeping, but rather very initial strategic steps that can be taken together, individually, and with the support of the ARC Hub. Now, each of the recommendations comes with suggestions for individual organizations and for the ARC Hub itself. And it's important for us to note that in order for these recommendations to be put in place, organizations must be actively acknowledging systemic racism and the legacy of colonialism, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. And so I really appreciate the opening remarks from the minister in that regard. This is a prerequisite to implementing the recommendations of this report. Organizations that are disputing or minimizing the impact of racism will be unable to make meaningful change in this area and will also risk increasing existing social injustice. And so let's launch right in. The first recommendation is that organizations and the sector begin to define a coherent organizational anti-racism strategy. It's clear that organizations are not clear on what is meant by anti-racism. For example, several organizations, as Tiana mentioned, reported public-facing anti-racism statements, but they had no clearly defined anti-racism strategy or objectives. Another example would be that training on diversity, accessibility, inclusion, anti-discrimination was cited as examples of anti-racism training in the survey responses. And while each of these are important on their own, they're not sufficient to be considered anti-racism strategy on their own. So doing things like building theories of change, frameworks, attaching SMART goals to organizations' anti-racism commitments will move those statements into actionable strategy and those intentions into results. Organizations should consider the commitments they made to the ARC framework as they develop their anti-racism strategies. And those who have already begun their anti-racism journey, there were some that have some strong initiatives, are encouraged to clearly define their anti-racism strategy in the context of the survey findings and their commitment to the ARC framework. And those organizations with deep experience in anti-racism are invited to share those learnings, case studies, and resources with ARC to strengthen the whole sector. ARC can support this recommendation by supplying a list of appropriate external consultants that signatories can hire to support anti-racism strategy building, develop a knowledge sharing hub, and a glossary so that there's sector adapted terminology and definitions for organizations to latch onto. The second recommendation is to create an enabling environment within organizations for productive dialogue. In environments where employees don't feel invited or safe to participate in anti-racism efforts, a culture of silence is formed, and employers miss opportunities to co-create solutions that are informed by the necessary multiple perspectives. Most organizations take a reactive approach to hosting discussions about race and racism. And in more than half of the respondents actually indicated that their organizations did not have safe, transparent, and formal reporting and redress mechanisms on racism and discrimination. So the need to create that enabling environment is very urgent, actually, especially for Indigenous, Black, and people who have been historically impacted negatively by racism. The dialogue strategies can be centered around bringing people together and to co-create meaning and build mutually informing relationships. I think in implementing this recommendation, organizations have to recognize that racial injustice can be physically and psychologically unsafe, emotionally unsafe too. So we need to clearly communicate that dialogue is taking place in an environment with zero tolerance for harassment and discrimination, and that there are stated redress policies in place and that employees know how to access them. And again, the ARC can really scale up sector efforts by creating opportunities for inter-organizational dialogue, for organizing anti-racism forums and discussion and learning sessions and working groups. So the third recommendation is to collaborate with international partners in design, in the development, and in implementation of new approaches. In-country staff in areas where Canadian organizations are working have to be involved in determining the shape of anti-racism efforts. We cannot come up with solutions that are rooted again in a singular and dominant worldview and make the same mistakes that we made in the past of coming up with approaches, of solutions, of initiatives that exclude the very people who we are setting out to serve. There has to also be an adoption of a transition mindset whereby strategy for gradual transfer of power and resources to local stakeholders is actually outlined as part of this process. And organizations have to establish formal feedback for international and domestic stakeholders. It's not always comfortable to be challenged by partners from the global south, but it will allow for more equitable practice. It will strengthen our programs and improve our communications. And ARC can assist sector organizations by collecting and creating best practices for developing accessible feedback mechanisms. I think about the feedback mechanisms that have been developed for mainstreaming gender work and for PSEA, so prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse. We can build on those practices in order to make sure that we're creating really good feedback mechanisms around anti-racism. The fourth recommendation is to measure, monitor, and use data that's disaggregated by race at all staffing levels. Now, 71% of organizations reported they're not disaggregating data about employees by race. Only 1% tracked salary data based on race, and only 3% reported, collected, or analyzed promotion and retention rates of staff that was disaggregated by race. Now, it may very well be that organizations don't know why they would need to do that, but what a colorblind approach really enables racial disparities to persist, because we have this saying in sort of North American organizational culture, what's measured is what gets done. And so if we're not measuring these things, we're not going to make concerted efforts to change the makeup of our organizations. And international development organizations have to reflect the multiracial, multi-ethnic community that it's setting out to serve, and the multicultural community in which we're located in Canada. So collecting data on race, gender, ability, age, religion, sexual orientation can enable organizations to measure the extent to which they're attracting and retaining a representative workforce who can bring the necessary cultural interpretations and social perspectives needed to reverse this history and practice of privileging white-centered knowledge. ARC can support organizations, again, by developing helpful materials in a knowledge hub, including survey templates, legal guidelines, and monitoring and evaluation tools, and organize virtual learning sessions where sector organizations can better understand the value of data collection, and practical tips for building, for attracting workforce from diverse social groups. The fifth recommendation is to prioritize and establish a regular cycle of anti-racism audits. 2/3 of the respondents hadn't conducted recent audits of their communications, fundraising, or advocacy content, just to confirm whether they're meeting their own guidelines for anti-racist commitments. And 59% of respondents indicated that evaluation practices to monitor policies and procedures did not include evaluating their anti-racist practices. So 75% of respondents didn't have any protocols to explicitly assess risk, for example, based on racial differences, and a very low number had performance measurements that included factors that were based on race. So we are recommending that organizations commit to a target date for a first audit and establish a regular cycle of audits depending on the size and needs of the organization, whether it be annually, every 2 years, every 5 years, but there should be a commitment to a regular audits, anti-racism audits, especially for communications and programming. ARC can support this recommendation by providing training and templates for communication and program audits, providing a list of anti-racist consultants, and facilitating audits or contributing to development and monitoring of evaluation measures. Maybe linking with academic institutions and other organizations who are conducting research on things like Indigenous monitoring and evaluation practices in order to help us shape a different way of measuring program success that emerges from respect for various ideas of prosperity and progress. The 6th recommendation is to invest. Invest finances, invest staff time, and invest a commitment from leadership. It takes time, money, and emotional energy to progress in anti-racism work. And most organizations, as Tiana mentioned, don't have staff with job roles that include anti-racism. And so it is necessary that this investment be made and be made as quickly as possible and as meaningfully as possible. ARC can support this recommendation by undertaking fundraising to unlock resources for training and resource development, and to provide grants for smaller organizations to complete their anti-racism work. ARC can also build anti-racist executive level hubs where CEOs can engage and can connect to discuss issues and approaches at a higher level. The investment needs to be sustained and lasting, and a genuine commitment to investment is needed in order to make this normative within the international cooperation sector. And last, but certainly not least, is that we are recommending that organizations integrate anti-racism into internal structures across all operations and management. We're very conscious that this particular recommendation has to follow through from preceding recommendations. And it's included because the work of integrating anti-racism at the structural level is critical to fundamental change and has to be thought of at the outset of anti-racism work. They must be embedded into every level of organizational operations, they being anti-racist principles. And the majority of sector already have formal guidelines, policies, and procedures that inform how they approach their work. Despite this, a small minority of anti-racist principles in any, let alone all of their core policies and guidelines. So in some cases, it just means a revision of existing language, or in addition to specific anti-racist principles to what they have. And again, this can be supported by ARC, and again, by assembling relevant case studies and examples of sector-specific anti-racist implementation in an ARC knowledge sharing hub. So we now hand over the recommendations to the working group to develop an action plan and to determine priorities for supporting organizations in implementing the recommendations. The framework provides steps that strengthen each other. The ARC statements help organizations outline a tangible anti-racist outcomes to achieve. The ARC survey reports and measures progress against those commitments. And now the ARC working group will leverage the priorities and recommendations identified in the survey to develop support mechanisms and resources to facilitate anti-racist transformation. The reality is that anti-racism work is challenging. It's slow moving and it's continual. It requires a committed effort and a willingness to integrate anti-racist principles into core modes of operation, to champion anti-racist work at all levels and to routinely examine organizational impact. This initiative, I believe, has potential to herald a cultural shift in the sector that may only begin to be felt 3, 4, or 5 years from now, and only if individual organizations and ARC remain persistent and resolute in their efforts to effect change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Musa. That was very insightful, and I'm looking forward to the comments and questions from the people with us today. So we are now, it's now time to ask questions to the task force members and our two co-chairs. You can type them in the Q&A. Some people have already done that, or you can raise your hand by clicking the little raise hand button. And if you want to ask your question over audio, then raise the hand and we will be able to unmute you. If you do, then we ask you, please use headphones as you speak. You also have an option to turn your video on if you'd like to be seen. We ask I repeat myself, but we ask that your questions remain related to the work of the task force and the findings of the report. So we are here to listen to what the task force has been doing for the past several weeks of work on the report. So we already have some questions. If I may, I'll start with a question. Well, two questions are related from Nina Nazar-Shoeva and Andriane Martel concerning the race data disaggregated by race. So the question is how you would collect race data, so to speak, and would that be optional or mandatory step in the hiring process, for example? Any best practices, basically, that's the question concerning race disaggregated data. And Andriane Martel adds, in terms of the race disaggregated data for the employees, that's one thing, but then what about collecting these data for participants to an activity offered by an organization, for example? What would you recommend on best practices? I don't know if you would like to start with that question.
In terms of recommending best practices, I just want to start off by saying we're talking about emerging practice for a reason, which is that our existing practices are rooted in all of the things that we've said right now. And so we have some precedents for disaggregating data, for example, for gender, particularly in recent years, that we can draw on. But we don't really have best practices for disaggregating data by race because there are some safety concerns and other things around that. And so this is an area, for example, that's a prime example of making sure that we are consulting with international partners in what those practices ought to be and what they should look like. And so we're designing those best practices, those emerging practices, together and in a different way than we've done before. And so this is part of why we're talking about this being slow moving. We're starting in some places from scratch. Does that answer the question?
I'll see if it would answer it for me, but I'm pretty sure. We'll see if they ask follow-up questions. If Tiana, you don't have anything to add, I can maybe jump in with another set of questions on the anti-racism audits. So what would these audits look like? Would it assess the recommendation 6? I'm not sure the formulation of the question, but then another question concerning the audits is that might ARC one day suggest or put in place an external practice of audit for signatories? Maybe the working group is thinking about that. And lastly, on audits, what would the accountability and governance structure look like for the audit? So basically, you can address the audit issue.
Thank you, Micah. So I think there's not one way that an audit could or should look. It depends on the priorities that are set by the organization. It depends on the anti-racist objectives that are set and established by any given organization, the size of the organization, the practices. So it's really difficult to put out a blanket audit approach. That said, there are some kind of standard steps forward. So first, it would look at defining the scope of the audit. So what's the time frame being studied, what's being studied, what areas are being included within the audit. So for example, in a communications audit, we might say, we're going back 6 months or a year, and we're looking at communications in our social media, in our written articles and our videos. And then from there, we would establish indicators that we want to study in that audit. So recurring narratives, layered terminology, the voice or the perspective that's featured in the stories, the process of content approval, whatever indicators that an organization would establish. There's room to incorporate qualitative feedback as well. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, and then we would go through looking at the past content that was created within the identified scope, and start to map out what implicit messaging our communications had in the past 6 months, and create a plan forward on how to move closer towards our anti-racist objectives moving forward. So there's a lot of different ways that it can look like. And as Musu mentioned, the role of ARC will largely be, creating templates and supporting organizations as they begin this process of implementing appropriate audits for their organization.
And as far as accountability and governance, to finish off the response to that question, is one of the hopes for this initiative is that ARC becomes a peer accountability group, that the signatories become a peer accountability group. So the surveys will be issued annually. People will be responding to that. And what we're looking for is movement in the sector as a whole and with individual organizations. And ARC will be watching the results of the survey to see where progress is being made and where more support is needed. And to that end, with the audits, the particular recommendation is that a target date has been set for a first audit. So we'd be looking for that for next year. And that a regular cycle of audits has been established. And that might be a survey question next year, or based on, allowing what the allowances are being asked for to set that up. It could be next year or the year next year or the following year. A question would be added to the survey to make sure that progress is being made.
That's very interesting. It also points to the fact that we are in constant reorganizing. We're going to change the surveys, giving our conversation. So it's not a closed process. It's a ongoing process. Some specific questions on the report. So first, someone said, Leo Eatart said that there's mostly small organizations that have answered the survey. So she was wondering if there's differences regarding or comparisons we can make between small, medium, and large organizations. Then another one was there ways to strengthen board and leadership diversity? So is there something about that in terms of recommendations? And the last one was, did the baseline survey collect data on anti-racism in program design and operations? So these are three.
Thank you. So for the first question, which was about the size of the organizations, 46% of respondents identified as small organizations, 46% identified as medium organizations, and 8% identified as large organizations. Now, we intentionally left this criteria quite open, and we enabled organizations to self-identify. Moving forward in future surveys, I think we do want to have a standard criteria for what defines a small, medium, and large organization, because there was some overlap and discrepancies there in terms of organizations' perceived size. But what was really interesting on that note about size is organizations often attributed their size to their capacity to be able to implement some of these initiatives. So I think it would be really, really interesting to have a more objective approach to looking at sizing. And then the second question that I remember is the program question. And yes, I do want to say that we had a good amount of questions and survey results that did come out of program and operations. I didn't want to spend too much time going over the data because I didn't want to just be listing out findings and throwing statistics at you all. But two kind of high level pieces that came out to me was one, that there are a lot of strong policies and procedures that are already in place in programs and operations. Most of these policies and procedures do not include anti-racist practices, but there's already a lot of very official guidelines. So there's a lot of mandatory training for gender, for example. There's a lot, over close to 70% of organizations have official guidelines on program development, So that's where we started to see opportunity to incorporate anti-racist principles within these existing mechanisms. And then the second kind of high level finding that came out of the data was that our anti-racist approach, or our race conscious approaches in program design and operations, is largely reactive. So for example, we found that 75% of organizations have security or safety protocols in their program operations, yet they often do not explicitly reference race. So they reference other vulnerabilities like language, citizenship, gender, age, but race is largely missing from those security protocols. However, if an affected individual raises the concern, so they have to explicitly raise the fact that their race might be a consideration when traveling or when entering different spaces, then an organization will respond to it. So, so we have seen how race has been a consideration, but it's largely been reactive. And then, sorry, I said there was two. I also want to add in a third one, which surprisingly, there is also a lot of organizations that are collecting data disaggregated by different social identity factors. So of their in-country partners. So by gender, by age, in some cases, ethnicity and race. As Musa said, there's a lot of opportunity to build on some of the existing practices and work that's being done to collect that data in country. I don't know if I answered all those questions. I forgot some of them, Mike.
Yeah, no, I can answer the one about leadership and board, but before I do that, I just want to welcome Jessica Fern from CanWatch, who was on our task force for accountability and questions that have to do with the methodology and maybe some different responses for different segment groups. Jessica was probably better placed to respond to some of those. But in terms of leadership and board, absolutely. The recommendations include looking at race at every level of the organization and putting in mechanisms to begin to reflect that multicultural, multi-ethnic, international nature of our work at every level of the organization. I mean, I would argue that international development, by the very nature of the work and the communities we serve, that there is an argument to be made for overrepresentation of multicultural groups within our workforce. But that's a conversation for another day. Welcome, Jessica. Thank you.
Now a very interesting question that I'm sure, we had conversations about that, so I will read it. It's how do you balance the need to center the voices of BIPOC in this space without placing the burden of holding all the emotional labor on these folks? So of course, white people can never speak over BIPOC, plus QTWOC voices, but how do we move responsibility for education beyond these folks in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the pieces that really stood out in the report, and there are two explicit recommendations that really feed into this question. So the first recommendation is the piece about creating an enabling environment. So creating an environment for dialogue, for productive, for safer spaces for dialogue, recognizing that when Black, Indigenous, and people from historically disadvantaged countries are engaged in these conversations, can be emotionally laborious. It can be psychologically damaging as well and harmful. And so creating an enabling environment is one where workplaces have training for their staff. So staff have appropriate language and understanding to approach this conversation in a respectful and productive way. And it's one where workplaces have very explicit anti-harassment policies and anti-racist policies and zero tolerance policies, so that as we're having these dialogues, that BIPOC are feeling are protected and to a certain degree. And then the second recommendation that I think speaks to this point is the investment piece. And I think that this is really important. When organizations are not investing in anti-racist work, it's oftentimes falling on the shoulders of those who have been oppressed to undo their own oppression. And so we're seeing how there's a huge percentage of organizations that have staff that are involved in this work, and yet a small minority of organizations that are funding the work. And so we need to have investment, both in terms of financial investment to enable this work to go on, as well as investment at a leadership level. So recognizing that staff alone cannot carry this work, and that leadership needs to set the tone and normalize anti-racism in this space.
Okay.
Thank you. Do you want to add something, Lucy?
No, I was just wondering if Jessica had anything to speak to differences in small, medium, and large organization responses, just to finish off that response.
Absolutely. I was actually just slowly typing out my answer, so thank you, Musu. So no, one of the things that we did within the survey was that we encouraged respondents to be able to elaborate on their answers, which as a general rule, most respondents did. So that allowed us to capture the nuances behind what might otherwise just be a not applicable answer. And there were not any significant differences in response rates between small or large organizations, or applicable and non. And I think this really speaks to the point that Tiana highlighted, which is, in this survey, we allowed organizations to self-identify. And that was, I think, very telling, because what we saw was that organizations may perceive themselves in a variety of different ways, but organizations of objectively comparable, let's say, financial or annual budgets, had very different answers to these questions, right? So it may not necessarily just be something as simple as your financial status as an organization corresponding to your answers, right? So that gave us a bit of a snapshot. One of the things was, so are they part of a federation or not? And what resources are there? So I think that there's a lot to unpack around organizational size. It's something that can point to resources, but there's actually a lot more nuance. And there were some amazing examples that came out from organizations of all sizes that I think would be great resources going forward.
Thank you, Jessica.
And I think that points to, oops.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I was just wondering, just to link it to what Tiana was talking about before about the investment piece. Some of the organizations that identified themselves as small sometimes also would respond to questions as in, we're too small to do whatever the question, the survey was asking. And so the perception of organizations of size and availability of resources also goes to their perception of whether or not they're able to do anti-racism work. And so it's, I think, even though we're talking about defining size going forward, it was an important exercise in this initial report to see how people self-identify and whether or not they felt they had the resources to do this work. So that's what I'm...
Thank you, Musu. And now a question on financing. So does ARC, it's a question on the chat and also in the Q&A, does ARC currently have the capacity if there's a lot of demand? So what expectations are on the current volunteers who are already on the task force, and also related to that, how might GAC or other governments support this initiative?
Tiana, do you want to go first, or should I? I can tackle that first. Sorry, can you say the first half of the question first, which is how volunteers, what's the burden on volunteers? Oops.
Sorry, do we have the capacity already if there's a lot of demand? I assume there was financial capacity, and will the task force rely on only volunteer work? Right
now, we're entirely a volunteer task force, which is unfortunate, but we know that Corporation Canada hosting ARC is already embarking on initiatives to try to fund the work. It is necessary, otherwise it's not going to go deep and it's not going to go far without funding. The excitement and the energy that we harnessed in this first year is very important, but it needs to be funded. And this is that, the investment piece at an institutional level, at organizational levels, at the sector level through ARC, hopefully, and through social level as represented by government is going to be imperative for the work to go forward. And what that looks like, we'll leave that to negotiation, but it's imperative that there's investment everywhere for this work, not just internally, but collectively. external to an individual organization. So when we talk about things like those organizations, the few that have deep anti-racism work, contributing that's an investment that can be made. But definitely paid staff and all those things, it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable. Tiana and I could tell lots of stories about how we got this report done, off hours and things like that, which is we wanted to get it done and wanted to get it done right. And my organization allowed me the time to do this, but it wasn't enough because my regular responsibilities were still there. It's not like they were taken away. So it still required some extra volunteer hours on my part, despite having a supportive organization.
I think I very much echo that, Musu. And I actually saw that the question came in from my boss, who saw me struggling and is likely concerned about my time capacity moving forward. But I do also want to say that this work is very much it needs to be collaborative. It cannot fall on the shoulders of 1, 2, or 3 people. And so I actually am quite pleased and encouraged by the way that Cooperation Canada has set up the anti-racism advisory group and the subcommittees. So the task force, which Musu and I co-led, it was really dedicated towards this survey and completing this report on an annual basis. But the working group, which is going to be convened, in which a number of different representatives from various organizations were interested in participating in, that's going to be more on an ad hoc basis. So it's going to be based off of the recommendations that we've identified, building out different activities that help close some of those gaps and help move forward on those recommendations. And it will convene different folks who can volunteer their time and their expertise towards specific goals on more time limited activities, as opposed to it being entirely led by a few people. So hopefully, as a sector, as we're all committed to these commitments that we've made, as we're all committed to anti-racist shifts, hopefully we can each do our part as well to carry the load, so it doesn't fall on just a few of us. So with that said, if you're interested in joining the working group and haven't done so already, please reach out to Cooperation Canada to offer any expertise that you can provide in helping implement the recommendations.
And leadership needs to free up staff time to do this work.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you. I will read one comment that's been made in the Q&A, and then maybe one last question before we close up our session. So Aline Alma says that it is critical that we look at our work at decolonizing practice, anti-racism work, and our work on feminist international assistance as interlinked and comprehensive rather than disparate parts. A lot of work has been done, a lot of work is to be done. Also to be mindful that we don't over-process the work that's already been done. At the end of the day, she says, I believe it is about relationship building and having a tough, truthful conversations. I just wanted to read this one because I felt it was really interesting. And then maybe one last question, 2 questions that are related. Someone says that, Patricia says that you mentioned several possible resources and advice ARC could provide. How will these resources be developed? And then someone else says, Zara Baptiste says, if there will be any funding mechanisms you can think of that organizations can apply to for this work.
So I'm gonna pass it over to Musu to answer those 2 questions. But before I do, I just wanted to add a comment to the piece about over-processing, which I completely agree. I think that there needs to be flexibility. I think that dialogue is something that we highlighted on numerous occasions throughout the report, recognizing that we need to be co-creating meaning, and we need to be collectively engaged on identifying our sector-wide objectives and moving towards them. That said, I also think that when we're existing in a system that has historically produced unequal outcomes, it will continue to produce unequal outcomes unless we intentionally and deliberately build these mechanisms into our ways of operating. So I think we need to find that balance between collaboration and not having too many processes, but also recognizing that the same way that racism has been embedded into our structures and our systems, anti-racism needs to be embedded into the structures and systems in order to undo this legacy of harm. I'll pass it over to you, Musu.
I'm going to try to answer this with Jessica, hopefully, just because when we're talking about resources and how we're going to make it available, I just want to point to something like CanWatch really made the monitoring and evaluation specialists available to us to collect, analyze the results of the survey and the recording and all that sort of work. We couldn't have produced this results without that. So ARC hopefully will start with gathering resources that already exist. Thankfully, I think it's true to say, Jessica, that there were no questions that we said zero. There were zero organizations that were doing any one thing. And so we have some resources within our organizations that we can draw from and collect them together so that we're sharing and strengthening each other. So that's the first thing I would say in terms of collecting resources. The other thing is that ARC itself is, part of Cooperation Canada. It's being hosted by Cooperation Canada, which itself is doing internal work. And so beginning to host training sessions, dialogue spaces, so that we are beginning to share ideas and to develop those new approaches together. They don't exist. What we are saying right now within the international development does not exist on a widespread basis. And it is very ad hoc and disparate. And so we need to, ARC has to be part of convening the sector in order to move this thing forward. I don't know, Jessica, do you have anything else to add to that?
I'd only add that, one of the things that is not included in the report, mainly to maintain confidentiality of answers, is we did invite respondents to give us details on consultants with whom they had worked, examples of training programs that they had undertaken, etc. And so we've gathered a good list of these different resources or these different contacts. We didn't disclose them all in the survey, but we also did ask for organizations to let us know if they would be interested in discussing the survey findings with us in more detail. So based on those, and there was a lot of enthusiasm for that. So based on those answers combined with the examples of resources that we've received, the task force has a great base of folks to go to say, okay, so can we share that out? Can we send this out? What other sources of funding might be available? Where did you tap into it? So really, I think that's an important piece, that although it's not in the survey, it is a really rich source of information to get us started. And as the recommendation was for folks to be doing the same, you can contribute and add to ARC and let us know, and we can add to that list of resources and use our various platforms, CanWatches, Cooperation Canada, others I know are here. We're happy to use our platforms to share those resources and that information out.
Thank you very much, Jessica. So thank you very much, everyone, for your insightful comments on this important work. We are now asking signatories of those present to join a discussion on June 28 at noon Eastern Time. The Zoom link or to register has been posted in the chat. This session will be used to get your feedback on a proposal being submitted to GAC, Global Affairs Canada, for an independent anti-racism hub to help achieve the objectives and recommendations outlined in the report. So signatories will be receiving an email with more details soon, and we did send the link in the chat. And also participants to this session and signatories will receive the final report in English and French by email towards the end of the week. We are, as we're speaking, we are finishing the final touches on translations and graphic design. So we wanted to make sure we're doing it well and taking care of each other, as everyone is volunteering their time and insight and institutional resources towards this joint cause. So we also are sending a quick survey in the chat if you want to answer concerning today's session. I was delighted to be part of this group and to host this session today, and I hope we will be having discussions on these topics very soon. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice rest of the day.